The two of them arrived in Prosperity Gulch looking like nothing more than dust-colored ghosts, apparitions shaped by the long, hard road that had delivered them. They were 14, but the gravity in their eyes made them seem older, ancient even. Finn and Rowan, twins born of a quiet man and a woman the earth had claimed too soon, now stood orphaned at the edge of a town that saw them as another mouth to feed, another problem to solve. They possessed little more than the clothes on their backs, a set of their father's well-worn tools, and a heavy, leather-bound journal filled with his meticulous, spidery script. Sheriff Brody, a man whose authority was etched into the weary lines of his face, met them with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the entire territory. He assigned them a plot of land that the town had long deemed cursed or, at best, useless, a parched, rocky square at the farthest edge of the settlement, pressed hard against the gaping maw of the Black Creek Ravine. "You can work it," Brody had said, his voice flat with a practiced lack of expectation. "Raise some goats, maybe. Stay out of trouble." The townsfolk watched them from the corners of their eyes, their gazes a mixture of pity and suspicion. The brothers were a curiosity, a stark reminder of the fragility of life in that unforgiving landscape. They accepted the plot without complaint, their silence an unnerving counterpoint to the town's bustling, opinionated nature. Their only companion was a lanky dog named Dust, whose ribs showed through his hide and whose loyalty was absolute. At night, in the dilapidated shack that stood on their new property, the brothers would not speak of their loss. Instead, by the flickering light of a single tallow candle, they would open their father's journal. It was not a diary of feelings, but a testament of observation. It held intricate drawings of rock strata, detailed notes on wind patterns, and complex calculations about weather cycles that stretched back decades. Their father had been a student of the earth, a man who believed the land had a memory, and that it whispered warnings to those patient enough to listen. They were alone, surrounded by a community that did not understand them, holding a legacy that felt less like an inheritance and more like a sacred, and heavy, burden. The sun beat down on the valley, bleaching the life from the very soil, and the future seemed as vast and empty as the sky above. Instead of breaking the unforgiving soil or seeking the charity of an apprenticeship in town, Finn and Rowan did something that immediately marked them as peculiar. They turned their backs on the flat, dusty land and faced the ravine. For weeks, they did nothing but study the immense cliff face that formed the far border of their property. They would sit for hours, from sunup to sundown, their father's journal open on their laps, comparing his drawings to the sheer wall of granite and sandstone before them. They lowered ropes, measured angles, and chipped away small samples of rock, examining them with an intensity that unsettled the townsfolk who passed by. Their dog, Dust, would lie patiently at their feet, his head on his paws, the only creature in the valley who did not question their methods. Mr. Abernathy, the proprietor of the general store and the town's primary source of gossip, was the first to give voice to the community's confusion. "Strange boys," he'd mutter to his customers over the cracker barrel. "Spend all day staring at a rock wall like it holds some secret. Ought to be planting, not daydreaming." The whispers grew louder when the brothers finally began their true work. They started hauling timber, not to build a proper cabin on their land, but toward the cliff's edge. They devised a system of ropes and pulleys, a complex web that clung to the rock face like a spider's silk. Their intention became clear, and it was so audacious, so contrary to all common sense, that it was met with outright disbelief. They were building their home directly into the side of the ravine, 100 feet above the stony creek bed below. Sheriff Brody rode out to see it for himself, his horse picking its way carefully through their stacks of lumber. He stared at the scaffolding they'd anchored into the stone, his expression hardening. "What in God's name are you doing?" he demanded, his voice echoing slightly in the vast space of the ravine. Rowan, the quieter of the two, answered without looking down from his perch. "Building our home, Sheriff." "That's not a home," Brody scoffed, shaking his head in dismay. "It's a cliff swallow's nest. A tomb. One good rock slide, one bad winter, and you're done for. It's a fool's errand." Finn paused his work then, looking the sheriff directly in the eye. "Our father taught us to read the stone," he said, his voice steady. "The stone is safer than the soil." The sheriff left, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He had tried. The town had tried. But the brothers were lost to their own strange logic, guided by the ghost of their father and his book of secrets. They were building their future on a foundation of air and rock, a choice no one in Prosperity Gulch could possibly understand. For 4 years, the brothers' lives were measured by the rhythmic scrape of the saw, the sharp report of the hammer against nail, and the groan of the ropes as they hoisted another beam into place. They grew from lanky boys into lean, sinewy young men, their bodies hardened by the ceaseless labor. Their project, once a source of confused gossip, became a standing joke in Prosperity Gulch. They were given names: the Ravine Rats, the Cliff Sparrows, Abernathy's Folly, after the store owner who took particular delight in mocking their efforts. "Saw the Sparrow Boys today," Abernathy would announce to anyone who would listen. "Practicing their flying, I reckon. One day they'll get it right." The laughter that followed was cruel, but the brothers never seemed to hear it. Or if they did, they gave no sign. They became specters in the town, appearing only to purchase supplies: flour, salt, nails, and rope, paid for with the last of the small sum their parents had left them. They spoke little, their faces set in grim, determined lines, their eyes focused on a goal that remained invisible to everyone else. Their isolation was nearly complete. No one visited their land. No one offered a helping hand. They were an island of strange ambition in a sea of pragmatic, dirt-farming settlers. The town thrived on a shared understanding of the world: you build on flat ground, you pray for rain, you fear the winter, and you trust your neighbors. The brothers violated every one of these tenets. They had chosen the void over the soil, trusted a dead man's book over living men's advice, and in doing so, had walled themselves off from the community as surely as they had built their walls of timber and stone. Only one person ever approached them with anything other than scorn. Samuel, an old prospector who had spent more of his life in the mountains than in any town, would sometimes stop at the base of the cliff on his way to trade his few pelts. He never offered advice, but he would watch them work for long stretches, his gaze filled not with judgment, but with a deep, knowing curiosity. One afternoon, he called up to them, his voice a dry rasp. "Heard a man once say that a house built on sand is for fools," he shouted. "But a house built on the mountain's bones, that's for a wise man or a prophet." He nodded once, a gesture of profound respect, and then moved on. Finn and Rowan exchanged a rare, small smile. That single piece of validation was more valuable to them than all the opinions in Prosperity Gulch combined. It was fuel. It was enough. They continued their work, their resolve hardened, their world shrinking to the rock face, the sky above, and the unwavering, silent loyalty of their dog. As the shelter neared completion, it became an undeniable feature of the landscape, a defiant anomaly clinging to the cliff. It was a marvel of engineering, a sturdy 2-room cabin with a small balcony, anchored to the rock with iron pins and heavy timbers. A cistern, carved partially into the stone itself, collected the rare rainwater that trickled down the cliff face. A narrow, terraced ledge they had painstakingly built housed a small herd of goats, their only livestock. Yet, the more permanent and secure their home became, the more profound their alienation from the town grew. Prosperity Gulch operated on the principle of mutual dependency. Neighbors helped raise barns, shared food during lean times, and stood together against the hardships of the frontier. The brothers' self-sufficiency was seen not as a virtue, but as an act of profound arrogance. It was a silent declaration that they did not need the town, that they believed their father's strange knowledge was superior to the collective wisdom of the community. Sheriff Brody, feeling a lingering sense of responsibility for the 2 orphans, made one final attempt to bring them back into the fold. He rode out to their property, this time dismounting and walking to the base of the cliff where their rope ladder was secured. "Finn! Rowan," he called out. Finn appeared on the balcony, now a young man of 18, tall and weathered. "Sheriff," he acknowledged, his voice even. "This is your last chance," Brody said, his tone more pleading than commanding now. "Your project is done. It's a fine piece of work, I'll grant you that. But it's no place to live a life. Come down from there. Be a part of this town. There's good land to be had now, work for men as strong as you. There's a future for you down here." He gestured to the sprawling valley, to the distant rooftops of the town, offering them a place in the world they had rejected. Rowan appeared beside his brother, his expression just as resolute. It was he who answered, his words carrying a quiet finality that left no room for argument. "Our future is up here, Sheriff." The rejection was absolute. Brody saw in their eyes not youthful defiance, but a deep, unshakable conviction that he could not penetrate. He had offered them community, and they had chosen isolation. He shook his head, a flicker of anger mixing with his pity. "Have it your way, then," he muttered, turning and walking back to his horse without another word. From that day on, the town washed its hands of the brothers. They were no longer a joke, but a ghost story, a cautionary tale whispered to newcomers about the two boys who had built a castle in the sky and cut themselves off from the world of men. They were utterly, and finally, alone. The fourth summer of their isolation was born in the crucible of a blistering, unforgiving heat. The sun rose each day not as a promise of light, but as a threat, a malevolent eye in a bleached white sky. The creek in the valley floor, which had always been a reliable source of life, dwindled to a sluggish, muddy serpent, and then to a series of stagnant pools. The vast pine forests that cradled Prosperity Gulch like a protective embrace began to die. Their deep green faded to a sickly yellow, then a brittle, tinder-dry brown. The very air grew heavy, thick with the scent of pine resin and dust, an atmosphere so charged it felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for a spark. The animals grew restless. Deer moved to higher, barer ground, and the usual chatter of birds in the morning fell silent. Samuel, the old prospector, made a special trip to the base of the brothers' cliff. He didn't carry any pelts this time, he carried a warning. "The mountain's breathing shallow," he rasped, his eye scanning the hazy, distant peaks. "The squirrels are burying their nuts a month early and the bears are moving west, away from the timber. Something's coming." The land knows it, the brothers knew it, too. This was the cycle their father had written about with such urgency in his journal. He called it the drought-fire convergence, a pattern that appeared every 50 or 60 years where a long period of low rainfall would culminate in a cleansing flame, a fire so vast and hot that it would reset the landscape. His notes were not apocalyptic, but pragmatic, detailing the geology of the ravine as a natural shield, a stone lung that would channel heat and flame upward, away from the protected hollow where they had built. Spurred by the oppressive heat and Samuel's warning, they made their final preparations. They checked the seals on their shutters, reinforced the heavy door, and spent 2 days clearing every last bit of scrub and loose rock from the cliff face below their cabin, creating a sheer, sterile barrier. They topped off their cistern with water hauled bucket by bucket from a deep spring they had found high in the ravine. In Prosperity Gulch, the anxiety was palpable but unfocused. The townsfolk complained about the dying crops and the low wells. Mr. Abernathy grumbled about the dust ruining his inventory. Sheriff Brody organized bucket brigades for the small fires that occasionally sparked in the dry fields, but they were easily contained. Their concerns were immediate, their vision limited to the valley floor. They saw the dry trees as a nuisance, not as millions of torches waiting for a single, fatal touch. They could not see the catastrophe that was already gathering its strength, just beyond the horizon. It began as an indistinct smudge against the fierce blue of the western sky, a faint discoloration easily mistaken for a cloud. Mr. Abernathy, standing on the porch of his store, pointed it out with a dismissive wave. "Looks like some fool prospector let his campfire get away from him," he declared to a small group of loiterers. But the smudge did not drift or dissipate. It grew. It darkened, thickened, and began to churn, blooming with a terrifying speed into a monstrous, roiling wall of smoke that swallowed the horizon and began to bleed across the sky. The sun, once a brilliant white, was choked into a dull, blood-red disk, casting the entire valley in a surreal, apocalyptic light. A collective gasp went through Prosperity Gulch. This was no campfire. This was a force of nature, a moving mountain of destruction. The volunteer fire bell began to clang, its frantic, tinny sound a pathetic protest against the deep, guttural roar that was now audible in the distance. Panic, sharp and primal, finally shattered the town's complacency. Sheriff Brody shouted orders, trying to rally men to form a firebreak, but the gestures were futile, like trying to stop a tidal wave with a picket fence. The fire was moving faster than a horse could gallop. The heat arrived first, a tangible, suffocating wave that buckled wooden storefronts and made the very air shimmer. Then came the embers, a blizzard of fiery snowflakes that ignited anything they touched. From their high perch in the ravine, Finn and Rowan had a god's-eye view of the end of their world. They worked with a calm, grim efficiency, herding their small flock of goats into the main room of the cabin, their bleats of terror swallowed by the rising wind. They sealed the heavy wooden shutters, plunging the interior into darkness, and then, using their pulley system, hauled buckets of water from the cistern to douse the roof and the exterior walls until they were dripping wet. Below them, Prosperity Gulch was consumed. The roar of the inferno was absolute, a physical presence that vibrated through the stone of the cliff. It was the sound of 1,000 freight trains, the sound of the world tearing itself apart. The orderly grid of the town dissolved into a chaotic swirl of orange and black, the screams of people and livestock a brief, terrible punctuation in the fire's all-consuming sermon. The world inside the cabin shrank to a bubble of suffocating heat and near-total darkness. The stone of the ravine itself seemed to hum with the impossible energy of the firestorm raging outside, a deep, vibrating groan that traveled through the floorboards and into their bones. Acrid smoke, sharp and biting, found its way through the smallest imperfections in their construction, making their eyes water and their lungs burn. The goats huddled in a corner, their fear a palpable thing in the small space. Dust, the ever-loyal dog, pressed himself against Rowan's legs, a low, continuous whine his only expression of the terror he felt. For hours that felt like an eternity, the brothers sat in silence, listening to the symphony of destruction. The roar was constant, a physical pressure on their eardrums, punctuated by the sharp crack of ancient trees exploding in the heat and the occasional thunderous crash of a rockfall somewhere in the ravine. They were inside a furnace, a tiny pocket of life suspended in the heart of an apocalypse. Here, in this crucible, the wisdom of their father and the purpose of their 4 years of labor were laid bare. The ravine, as his journal had predicted, was functioning as a colossal flue. The sheer rock faces on either side, devoid of fuel, created a channel. The immense heat from the burning valley floor generated a powerful updraft, sucking the flames and superheated air upwards, creating a river of fire that flowed over the top of the gorge, hundreds of feet above their heads. Their small cabin was tucked into a protected eddy, shielded from the main current of the inferno. The rock absorbed and dissipated the worst of the heat, and the water they had poured over the wood sizzled and steamed, creating a thin, protective barrier. As the hours crawled by, the deafening roar began to subside, replaced by a deep, rumbling crackle. The intense vibration in the stone lessened. Slowly, agonizingly, an eerie, unnatural silence began to settle over the land. When the first weak, grey light of dawn filtered through a tiny crack in a shutter, the world outside was quiet. Rowan, his movements stiff and slow, unlatched and pushed open one of the heavy shutters. The smoke was still thick, but the light poured in, revealing a scene of absolute and utter desolation. The verdant valley was gone. In its place was a monochrome nightmare of black and grey. The forest was a skeletal graveyard of charred, needle-less spires. The town of Prosperity Gulch was nothing but a grid of smoking foundations and blackened chimneys pointing accusingly at the ash-filled sky. But their home, their impossible shelter on the cliff, was untouched. It stood, solid and secure, a tiny, defiant island of survival in an ocean of ruin. They were alive. In the days that followed, the survivors of Prosperity Gulch began to crawl out of the earth. A handful had made it to the creek bed, immersing themselves in the muddy water as the fire passed over. Others had taken refuge in deep root cellars, emerging choked with smoke and disbelief into a world they no longer recognized. They were ghosts, their faces smeared with soot, their eyes hollow with a grief too profound for tears. They wandered aimlessly through the ruins, sifting through the ashes of their former lives for anything, a melted piece of jewelry, a charred photograph, any small proof that the world they had known had ever existed. Sheriff Brody was among them. His home, his office, everything he had ever owned, was gone. He moved like a man in a trance, his authority burned away with his town. As the dazed survivors gathered in what was once the town square, their gazes, one by one, were drawn upward. There, suspended against the grim, grey sky, sat the cabin. It was pristine, impossible, an ark that had ridden out the fiery flood. In the context of their total devastation, it looked like a mirage, a cruel trick of the light. The initial reaction was a bitter, silent resentment. Why them? Why had the strange, antisocial boys been spared when everything and everyone they cared about had been taken? But as the reality of their own desperation set in, no food, no clean water, no shelter, that resentment slowly curdled into a dawning, humbling realization. They had been wrong. Terribly, catastrophically wrong. With a heavy heart and heavier feet, Sheriff Brody began the slow walk toward the ravine. He reached the base of the cliff and looked up at the rope ladder that the brothers had lowered. He began to climb, his movements weary, each rung an admission of his own folly. When he finally pulled himself onto the small wooden balcony, he saw Finn and Rowan standing there, their faces somber but not triumphant. He looked past them, into the simple, orderly cabin, saw the goats, the full water barrels, the sacks of flour. He saw foresight. He saw wisdom. He turned back to the two young men he had once dismissed as fools, and his voice, when it came, was a broken whisper. "You knew," he said. It was not an accusation. It was a confession of his own blindness. "You knew this was coming." Before the brothers could answer, another figure appeared at the top of the ladder. It was Mr. Abernathy, his fine storekeeper's clothes reduced to blackened rags, his face a mask of shame. He looked at the brothers, at the shelter he had so mercilessly mocked. "We called you fools," he choked out, the words catching in his throat. "We laughed at you." The laughter had died in the flames. The pride of Prosperity Gulch had been rendered to ash, and in its place was a terrible, clarifying humility. The outcasts, the ravine rats, were now the keepers of the future, offering cool, clean water to the very men who had offered them nothing but scorn. The story of the fire and the shelter that survived it became the founding myth of a new community. Prosperity Gulch was never rebuilt in the scorched valley. Its name had become a bitter irony, a testament to a foolish pride that had led to ruin. Guided by the quiet wisdom of Finn and Rowan, and by the detailed, prescient knowledge contained within their father's journal, the survivors chose a new location for their settlement. They built it several miles to the north, on a wide plateau protected by a series of natural rock ridges that would act as fire breaks, with a reliable spring that flowed even in the driest years. The brothers, once the town's most ostracized members, became its heart. They were not mayors or sheriffs, their leadership was of a different kind. It was practical, humble, and rooted in a deep understanding of the land they inhabited. They taught the other settlers how to build not just for comfort, but for endurance. They shared their father's knowledge of weather patterns, of which trees to clear and which to leave, of how to site a home to be safe from wind and fire and flood. Their expertise, once seen as bizarre eccentricity, was now recognized as essential wisdom. The ravine cabin remained, a silent monument perched high on the cliff face, overlooking the scarred valley. It became a landmark, a point of pilgrimage for the new generation. Children born after the fire would be taken to the base of the cliff and told the story of the two brothers who listened to the stone instead of to the crowd. It was a lesson etched into the very geography of their new lives. The shelter itself was never a home again in the same way. It became a repository of knowledge, a library containing their father's journal and their own subsequent observations. It was a schoolhouse where the most important lessons were taught: humility in the face of nature's power, the value of foresight over short-term gain, and the courage to follow a path that others deem foolish. The brothers never spoke of their vindication. There was no "I told you so," no trace of arrogance in their demeanor. They had not built the shelter to prove anyone wrongs, they had built it to survive. Their legacy was not the enduring structure of wood and stone, but the enduring change in the mindset of their people. They had lost a town, but in its place, they had forged a community built not on prosperity, but on resilience. What is the nature of wisdom? Does it announce itself with trumpets and fanfare, or does it arrive quietly, dressed in dusty work clothes, and begin the slow, unglamorous work of survival? The brothers of the ravine were not prophets. They made no grand pronouncements and claimed no divine insight. They were merely sons, obedient to the careful, patient observations of a father who taught them that the world speaks in a language older than words. He taught them to read the wrinkles on the face of a mountain, to understand the sigh of the wind through dry pines, and to respect the long, slow rhythms of the earth. They built their impossible home not as an act of defiance against the town, but as an act of reverence for the world as it truly was, powerful, cyclical, and utterly indifferent to human pride. Prosperity Gulch was a town built on a dream of permanence, on the deeply held belief that the land could be tamed, that the forests were an endless resource, and that the good years were a promise, not a temporary gift. It was a comfortable belief, a human belief. And it was reduced to ash in a single, terrible night. The fire did not pass judgment, it simply acted according to its nature. It was the valley's pride, its willful blindness, that turned a natural event into a human catastrophe. If you were there, standing in the smoking ruins of everything you had built, of everything you had believed, what would you have thought? Looking up at that single, solitary house, untouched by the flames, would you have called it a miracle? Or would you have recognized it for what it was, the inevitable result of seeing the world clearly? Perhaps you would have learned the most fundamental truth of all. That the safest ground is rarely the easiest to build upon. That the strongest walls are not those that keep the world out, but those that are built in accordance with its deepest laws. And that sometimes, the most profound act of community is to have the courage to stand alone, to turn away from the noise of the crowd, and listen, with all your heart, to the silent, irrefutable wisdom of the stone.